I'm going to show you a basic bread roll recipe. So what I have is my strong plain flour in the mixing bowl. I've also added into it some salt, and I'm now going to add into it the yeast. I'm going to make a fairly small quantity of mixture just because I don't have a very large family, and then I'm going to add in a little bit of oil. Next stage then is to add in some hand hot water to bind this together into a dough. So I'm going to mix all those things together. Initially I kept the salt and the yeast separately because whilst the salt is essential to the bread to add flavour to it, it also can kill the yeast if you put it in at too early a stage. So it's better to keep them slightly separate if you can. Okay, now I've added most of my water in and mix it around with my table knife. And I need to see then if it'll actually go into a dough. Now it's classed as being a fairly craggy dough or shaggy dough, that's the words that they use to describe it. Now you can put one hand in and see whether you think that that mixture is going to stick together, but hopefully you can see that it's not. It's going to need just a tiny little bit more hand hot water adding into it. And it's important to try and actually get the water in fairly quickly. Otherwise sometimes the gluten tends to almost like seize and not accept any more water into it. Okay, that's much better. So use the dough to clean out the mixing bowl and then put your dough onto a floured table, and then obviously depending on how sticky it is will depend on how much extra flour you need to add into it. And you're then going to knead it. And you're going to knead it for 5 minutes. Now while I'm doing that, I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about the ingredients. So I use the strong flour at the beginning because it has a higher percentage of gluten. Now the gluten is actually the protein that is formed from gliadin and glutenin, and when they're hydrated with the water or the milk, whatever it is that you're having in your mixture, they actually form the gluten. So the strong flour has a high percentage of protein in it. Now I could use wholemeal flour if I wanted to, and if I did, that would obviously add into it extra NSP or extra fibre. What I then find though is that I actually needed to add a little bit more moisture, a little bit more liquid into my dough, because the bran in there absorbs the liquid quite quickly. And you need to have, it's really important that you've got a nice elastic dough, that's what we're looking for. Now the yeast that I used today was an Easy Blend yeast from a tin. It also comes in a packet, and that's really easy because you just mix it straight in. If you're using fresh yeast, or you're using one of the slower action yeasts, you sometimes have to hydrate them with some water and a little bit of sugar and leave them until they're frothy. But at the end of the day, they still do the same job, and that is that the yeast cells will reproduce and increase in number. As they do that then, they're going to give off some alcohol and some carbon dioxide gas in a process that's called fermentation. Now in order for fermentation to happen, it needs time and moisture and food to grow. Now you don't have to have warmth, as in like sourdough, for those of you who've made that at home will realise warmth is not that important, but if you don't have warmth, you're going to need an awful lot more time for your dough to actually rise. Now you can see hopefully how the kneading process is, that the dough is incredibly soft and elastic. And that's a good thing, so it doesn't matter that I'm a tiny bit sticky, because on the whole the dough is moving quite quickly. Now I used water in mine, and I used hand hot water, so that's so that it feels relatively warm but not hot on your hands, because you don't want to kill the yeast at the outset. And it's important, as I say, that we get this nice soft stretchy dough. The fat that I used today, I used some oil. Some recipes have a very small amount of butter added into them, which would have been rubbed in. Oil I find is very simple, but this just makes the bread nice and soft. Sometimes it gives a little bit of colour depending on the fat that you're using, and it also makes your bread rolls keep a little bit longer. It increases the shelf life. Otherwise they tend to go quite stale quite quickly. It also slows down the action of the yeast a little bit and weakens the gluten a tiny bit, which gives you that sort of soft crumb. Now, what I'm going to have to do in a moment is to shape my dough. Ideally, if I had a lot of time, I would leave this to rise for 15-20 minutes until it started the yeast to reproduce. Okay, so when you're doing that at home, that is definitely the thing to do, to leave it to rise. But I just want to give you a quick overview of how this works. So, if you remember, I had a fairly small mixture. I'm going to divide mine into bread rolls, and I'm going to get probably from this mixture about 5, I would say. Now, if I wanted to make an enriched dough, if I wanted to make something like Chelsea buns from this mixture, I would have had to have used some milk in the mixture. I might have also added a little bit of sugar into the mixture just to make it sweet for the Chelsea buns. Okay, so I've got my 5 balls of dough, which hopefully you can just about see. And the next stage, quite oddly, is going to be to cover them with the mixing bowl like so. Okay, now just because I'm showing you how to do this, I'm just going to move these out of the way. Now the idea is that this creates a greenhouse. If you've got time, it's a good idea to wash your mixing bowl out, dry it quickly and have it really, really hot. And then it automatically, because there's actually some warmth in there, starts the rising process. So I'm just going to put mine out of the way so I can just show you how to knead one of them. How to shape one of them, I should say. Okay, so here's my ball of dough that I had. Most of the shapes that you make require you to have your bread in a sausage shape. Okay, so there is my sausage. Now, if your dough isn't moving very well on the surface, sometimes the easiest thing is actually to wet your hand, not to have flour on the table. Okay, so the first one I'm going to make is a knot then. So I'm simply going to get my dough, turn it round, and there is my finished knot. And I assure you that as they rise, they do improve in appearance slightly. Next stage then, I'm going to make a plait. So for this one, I actually need to have 3 long pieces. So just like when you're plaiting hair, same process. Last one. I'm going to pop those together, and then I'm just going to plait them like I would do if it was hair. And I'll move the camera in a few minutes so you can see them all on the tray. Next one, I'll just make into like a twist. So I've made one very long sausage, and then I'm going to hold it like so, and then twist it round like that. I can also make something called a cottage loaf. Okay, now this is slightly different. So you get your piece of dough, you divide it into 1/3 and 2/3, and this time you roll it into a ball. So you have it on the flat of your hand, palm of your hand, roll it round, and as you're rolling, you're sort of cupping your hand a little bit so that you get a ball that's got a nice smooth top. And then you do with the same with the bottom. Now you might think that the easiest thing to do is when you're making bread rolls is, oh, I'll just do them all the same, I'll just do them all round like that one. Actually, that's the hardest one to get right. Next stage then is the smaller blob, and you end up with basically like a snowman, and then you put your finger through the centre of the dough. I'm going to need a bit of flour on my finger. Okay, so that becomes the cottage loaf, and then I've just got one left. So I'm going to make this into like an S shape. So there's my sausage, and then I'm going to curl each one, hopefully you can see, like that. Like that, into the shape. So now I've got my tray of shapes, and these are going to have to rise. Now, as I say, it would have been much better if I could have left the dough to rise before I started. Okay, so in an exam situation, that's what you would do. You'd make your bread rolls at the beginning, you'd leave the dough to rise in a normal covered mixing bowl. Then you'd shape them, pop them on the tray, and then onto that then you put the cling film and you leave them to rise again. So there they are, covered in the cling film now so that they can rise. When they've risen then, I'm going to decide if I would like to glaze them, and have a choice of either glazing them with milk or with an egg wash, or I can just put water on. And if I want to, I can put some seeds on them, like poppy seeds, sesame seeds, pumpkin seeds, etc., to give them a nice finish. Okay, so that's the bread rolls waiting now to rise. Now, whilst they were doing that rising, the carbon dioxide, or whilst they are rising, I should say, the carbon dioxide is making it rise. If I was to relieve them like this, as I say, before I shape them, and I'd done something called knocking them back, what I would have done, in fact, was to get rid of any large air bubbles and make it into a fine dough again. And then, of course, it would rise again with slightly smaller air bubbles, and it gives you just a slightly finer dough. The baking then, when they go into the very hot oven, the bread's going to rise quickly, and the bread rolls are going to carry on rising. But whilst then they're in the oven, the yeast cells will actually get killed off. Okay, and the carbon dioxide that's produced gives it that open texture, because the gases expand and they push up the dough. Eventually then the starch that's actually in the flour will gelatinise, and the protein will coagulate, the gluten will coagulate, and it will form that set framework in the bread. Finally then, the sugars that are naturally present in the flour will caramelise to give them an attractive brown colour. The bread rolls have risen now. It's taken them probably about 30 minutes to increase in size this much. I've decided to do an experiment, and I have glazed one of them just with water, which is that one. I've done two of them with egg, that one and this one. And then I've done two of them with milk. I don't have any poppy seeds, so I've used some nigella seeds, which is what you tend to get in naan bread, to sprinkle onto mine. And then when they're done, I'll show you the difference in the browning. The bread rolls have now browned. The ones that have the egg on have definitely got a glossier finish. There's not an awful lot of difference between the ones that had milk on and the ones that were plain, but they need to be golden brown, and they need to sound hollow when you pick them up and tap the bottom of them.